Well, joining me now from London is Charlie Eccelshare. He's a journalist at Telegraph Sport. And in Chicago, we have Alan Linton. He's an academic and host of All Sports on WHPK, a non-profit community radio station. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. We don't always do sports stories, and I guess the reason we're doing this story is because it's not quite a sports story. Scandals spawn more scandals, spawn discussion, and at the heart of it all was a point docked and then a game docked. Charlie, was it the correct decision from the chair umpire to dock Serena Williams a point and then a game?
I think it was, yeah. I think in isolation, all three of the incidents were made correctly, and applying the letter of the law, they amounted to the game penalty. It's possible he could have acted with more discretion. He could have been more lenient, but there's absolutely an argument to say he acted in the right way and applied the rules as he saw fit. And I think he could leave the Arthur Ashe Stadium on Saturday with his head held high.
Alan Linton, she violated the rules of the game. She got penalized, no more, no less. Those are the rules of the game. It's nothing bigger than that. What do you think?
It's a little bit bigger than that. Certainly by the letter of the law, absolutely the penalties apply. But I think the larger context is do we see a fair application of the rules, a fair application and leniency from chair umpires between the women's game and the men's game? I think overall, throughout the U.S. Open and overall in tennis, I think the answer is no. And that's the part that I think has really grappled a lot of people's attention on this tennis story.
Okay, so Charlie, there isn't a fair, uniform application, and there's a double standard at play. Would you agree with that?
I would say there's inconsistency across the board. And absolutely, there are cases where men get away with a huge amount, and that's absolutely not fair. But it varies within the men's game as well, and there's a huge amount of favoritism shown towards the top players. You know, it takes a lot more courage for an umpire to take on the likes of, say, Rafael Nadal or Roger Federer.
But that you make your point there. I mean, you make Alan's point there because she's the top of the top, right? She's not just, you know, the best player over the past 5 years. She's the best player over the past, 15 years or so. So by that theory, the umpire should be really intimidated by her and probably favor her, kind of give her kind of home advantage at all times, right?
There's an issue, though, because the problem is there's inconsistency between umpires even. And so Carlos Ramos, the umpire in charge on Saturday, is known for being one of the strictest, one of the biggest sticklers for the rules. And he's one of the very few umpires who in the past has taken Nadal, Murray, Djokovic to task. So it was unfortunate for Serena that she was up against someone who is like that. We know he's like that. The people who put him in charge know he's like that. And the issue comes that you've got an umpire like Mohamed Layani doing something entirely opposite. Early the previous week, he'd come down in his chair and given Nick Kyrgios a pep talk, which is a terrible look for the sport. But that's not really Carlos Ramos's fault. His style is to be down the line, go with the rules, and it was a perfect storm that it happened to be with Serena on that women's final.
Alan Linton, she said that this happened just because I am a woman. I'm a bit annoyed that we don't have a woman on the panel. We did try. But she said, just because I'm a woman, he did this to me. Would you back that fully, unequivocally, that that's the way it was and that was the context behind Carlos Ramos's behavior as the umpire?
I don't think I can back that claim entirely. Certainly, as pointed out, Carlos Ramos is an incredibly strict letter of the law umpire, and I think his decision making in this process can be questioned, but that is just his decision making. I think the larger space, though, that we're engaging in is thinking about how we, as a society, and how tennis has marketed and branded their star players with respect to their confrontations with chair umpires, their place in the game. And so my contention is much more with the idea of an umpire in a final with history on the line, stepping in and inserting himself into the contest. And if we look at the arc of tennis and the arc of sports, oftentimes the leniency or the lack thereof, not just from one chair, but across umpires. Look at Elise Cornet earlier in the U.S. Open, be penalized for changing her shirt in the sweltering heat. That's something that's not often, hardly ever equally penalized. So
Right.
Carlos Ramos may be someone that would give out the same punishment there, but we've seen over the years that that's just not the case.
Okay, so Charlie, in football, I know there was criticism of Mark Clattenburg and other refs that people felt that they tried to be bigger than the game or they tried to make themselves the sort of center of attention, right? Would you maybe then agree with Alan's argument that we're seeing in the women's game, umpires do this more often than they do in the men's game, where they try to take center stage and exert their authority a bit more? And maybe that's where the sexism or the claims of sexism reside.
Well, I think there are so many things at work here, but one thing that always stuck with me about officiating was reading an interview with the legendary football referee Pierluigi Collina. And he said one of the biggest myths about officiating is that you've had a good game if you haven't been noticed. He said that's just categorically not true. If you have to make big calls, you're going to be noticed, but you still have to make them. You can't make yourself invisible. I think, Ramos in this case, yes, this is the thing, it's not clear cut. Another umpire on another day would have shown more discretion, would have been more lenient, and that's not necessarily wrong. But they are human beings as well, umpires. They have different styles. And I honestly don't think, given how well respected he is, given he has no history of sexism or misogyny, that was what it was. I think, yes, he is someone who applies the rules strictly, and I think, as has been demonstrated, he does that with men's matches as well. And also, can I just make a point? There is so much sexism in tennis, so much, and there are so many issues that should have been raised previously and haven't had the same amount of coverage. And that's understandable because Serena Williams is a huge name. But I think for organizations like the USTA and the WTA to come out and publicly humiliate an umpire of theirs really is absolutely wrong. And I feel they're bandwagon jumping, and they need to look at themselves as well, because there have been a lot of issues with sexism that they haven't really spoken out.
Okay, so Alan, are they using this as an opportunity to maybe sort of brush all the other stuff under the carpet, the stuff they should have addressed beforehand? Whereas this one, I mean, you're saying yourself, it's not absolutely clear cut, right? On a scale of those saying it's complete sexism to the other end of the scale where people are saying she's just throwing a tantrum, I guess there's arguments within that sort of realm, right? But are they bandwagoning? And this might not be the most exact, direct example of sexism, Alan.
Well, this becomes the big problem with the story, and to some degree, the downside of it involving Serena Williams. She's such a big name, so you can put the spotlight on the double standard as she did, but because it's such a fraught superstar in the sport, there does appear to be a kind of pushing, and I would go as far to say scapegoating on just Carlos Ramos, the idea being that he needs to deal with his own particular understanding and interpretations of the rules. But overall, the larger point about sexism, at least in tennis, extends not just to the on-court officiating, which we've seen certainly at the U.S. Open and certainly over the years involving other players, including Serena Williams, her sister Venus Williams, but also the way we think about and the images and conversations around women in the sport. You think back to the French Open and the so-called catsuit that she wore, and the idea that coming into the U.S. Open, that some part of the conversation was the French Open changing their wardrobe standards. In large part, it seems because of what Serena Williams wore at this year's French Open. And so just the idea that we have a different standard of how women should dress, how they should look, the notion that she threw a tantrum when in the men's game, certainly there have been historic players, John McEnroe, chief among them, where their anger has been a part of their branding. It shows passion. I think the conversation around what we do and how we think about not just the on-court play, but everything from walking out and the perceptions of how they should look, feel, dress, and behave speak to the climate of sexism in tennis.
Alan, did you see the Herald Sun, the Australian cartoon, afterwards?
I unfortunately did.
Right, so as I said beforehand, sort of controversy spawns more controversy. That is deemed by many to be a racist cartoon. It shows her, perhaps, and some people have looked at it historically and they say there's echoes of blackface and other caricatures of black people in the past. She's throwing a tantrum. There's a dummy. She's spitting the dummy on the court and so forth. That's by Mark Knight, who's defended himself. His employers defended him. Do you believe there's an element of... I don't know how to ask this. Do you believe race is also central to this beyond issues of sexism, especially as this has played out?
It's hard for me not to see race as a part of everything, just as the nature of engaging in kind of a larger global society. But I think for this particular cartoon, it absolutely strikes me as racist and racially offensive, particularly because Serena Williams and her body have always been a topic of conversation in the press. Certainly accusations from when she was younger on the junior tour that she may have been a man, to her not having the same quote unquote traditional physique that we see of other tennis players, other more marketable tennis players like a Maria Sharapova. And so it's hard for me not to disentangle the history and legacy specifically to Serena with respect to body shaming and the racial history behind that. But yeah, it struck me as incredibly insensitive and very much so racially offensive and racist.
Charlie, what did that cartoon tell us?
That there's a huge amount of racism and ignorance in this world, and that I don't live there, so I can't say for 100%, but from what I hear from people who live there, Australia, there are real issues with this. And I think this underlined that. And then the response of the newspaper to double down on it and to, re-emphasize the point was sickening, and does reflect what's been said, that this has been an issue in tennis for a long, long time. And Serena, was booed in Indian Wells, in her home country. Serious racial overtones there, and it's been there throughout. And to see that it's still there in 2018 is disappointing. I think we all hope that we're maybe moving beyond that, and that's why everything that's happened on Saturday, it's been this powder keg that's exploded, and so many issues have come back to the surface. And this being the most egregious example of that.
Alan, what can we learn from this entire scandal and its fallout?
I think we can learn that even though you can be arguably the greatest women's tennis player and one of the greatest athletes of all time, that doesn't prevent other people creating a larger moment for what's happening. Certainly here in the United States, there seems to be large divisions between Serena fans, people pushing back against suggestions of racism and sexism, and then people that are just fans of tennis that are kind of caught in between, debating the rules and what have you. I think the frustrating part here is that it takes a large failure in the largest stage to have a conversation that's long overdue about sexism and racism and consistency between the men's and women's game.
Okay. Charlie Eccelshare and Alan Linton, it's been good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.